Sheboygan County, Wisconsin, August 1885. The air along the Lake Michigan shore was thick with the scent of cut pine and curing hay, a smell of progress and settlement. But on Sjoerd Hoogendoorn's small plot of land, a different smell was rising. The sharp, green scent of cut phragmites reeds, tons of them, piled like a second harvest beside his newly erected 16-foot pine cabin. The cabin itself was unremarkable, a tight-seamed box of fresh lumber meant to keep a family safe. What Sjoerd was doing to it, however, was drawing stares, then whispers, then open mockery from his neighbors. He wasn't chinking the logs or applying another layer of siding. He was wrapping his house in grass. Albin Witherspoon, the lakeshore lumber broker who had sold Sjoerd the pine for the cabin frame, leaned against the fence post of the adjacent property, his arms crossed. He was a man who understood wood, its weight, its strength, its insulation value per inch. He watched as the Dutchman, Sjoerd, methodically bundled the long, hollow reeds into tight sheaves, each one the thickness of a strong man's thigh. With his wife Antje handing him lengths of hemp twine, Sjoerd began tying these bundles directly to the outer walls of his cabin, creating a strange, shaggy coat. "What in God's name is that foolishness?" Witherspoon said, not to Sjoerd, but to Jedediah Stone, a farmer whose land bordered the Dutchman's. "He's building a haystack around his house." Jedediah spat a stream of tobacco juice into the dust. "Heard him telling Caleb Finch it's for warmth. Says the grass is warmer than wood." Witherspoon laughed, a short, sharp bark that carried across the field. "Warmer than wood? The man's mad. A single ember from his chimney, and he'll have the biggest funeral pyre in the county. It's a tinderbox, not a house." The word spread through the small community of settlers. Sjoerd Hoogendoorn, the quiet Frisian who had arrived the previous year, was the grass house Dutchman. Children pointed. Men shook their heads as they passed on their wagons. The structure grew thicker, stranger. He wasn't just piling reeds against the walls. He was weaving a monstrous 3-foot-thick sleeve of grass, tied off every 4 inches, with the reeds lapped diagonally like the scales of some immense reptile. It looked less like a house and more like a massive, primitive nest. It was, by every known standard of frontier construction, utterly crazy. What did this Dutch Frisian reed bundler, a man whose trade was bundling marsh grass for the roofs of waterlogged Sneek, understand about the physics of trapped air that a lumber broker, a man who sold solid timber by the ton, had completely missed? The answer to that question would not only save his family, but would change the very definition of a warm house along the brutal shores of Lake Michigan. It's a story of quiet knowledge against loud opinion, and a powerful lesson in how survival sometimes requires looking not for a stronger wall, but for a better coat. If you stick with me, I promise you will learn the fundamental principle of insulation that this humble craftsman knew in his bones, a principle that modern building science would take another century to fully embrace. Before we uncover that, take a moment to subscribe to our channel and ring the bell so you don't miss other stories of forgotten ingenuity. And let us know in the comments, what's the most unconventional building material you've ever seen used? Sjoerd Hoogendoorn was not a carpenter, he was not a logger, nor was he a farmer in the Wisconsin sense of the word. He was a reed decker, a reed thatcher, from the water-woven province of Friesland in the Netherlands. His hands understood the language of the marsh. They knew the heft of a cutting scythe, the precise tension of tarred twine, the hollow rasp of 1,000 phragmite stems being bundled into a perfect sheaf. His world had been one of water, wind, and grass. For generations, his family had thatched the roofs of Sneek, creating waterproof, breathable, and astonishingly warm ceilings from the very plants that choked the canals. He knew, with an intimacy that required no scientific text, that the power of the reed was not in its solid fiber, but in the air trapped inside its hollow stem. A phragmite's stalk, he could tell you, was nearly 80% air by volume. He had brought his wife, Antje, and their two small children, Jelle and Femke, to America for the promise of land. Solid land. Something a Frisian never took for granted. They arrived in Sheboygan County in the late autumn of 1884 with just enough time to erect a standard-issue pine cabin before the first snows. That first winter was not a hardship. It was a siege. It was a cold, so profound and invasive that it seemed to have a physical weight. Sjoerd, who had known the damp chill of the North Sea gales his entire life, had never experienced a cold that actively tried to unmake the world. The evidence of its victory was everywhere. A new pair of leather boots he'd bought in Milwaukee, his one expensive concession to the American frontier, came apart before their second wearing. The frozen ground was so unyielding that the stitching on the welt simply surrendered, the sole peeling away like a rind. The family's canary, a small splash of yellow song that had survived the Atlantic crossing, fell silent by vespers one evening in December. It didn't die. It just stopped singing, a tiny feathered engine conserving its last reserves of energy, and it would not chirp again until the April thaw. In the pantry, a burlap sack of rye flour, stored against an outer wall, became so brittle with frost that it cracked open when Antje tried to move it, the flour within frozen into a solid, useless block. They spent that winter huddled around the stove, burning through a mountain of wood that provided a small circle of heat in a vast sea of biting cold. The children were never without their coats. Antje's hands were cracked and raw. Sjoerd felt a quiet, gnawing shame. He had brought his family to a new world only to see them suffer in a way they never had in the old one. He had failed. As he lay awake at night, listening to the wind find every microscopic gap in the pine walls, he wasn't thinking about thicker logs or more mortar. His mind was back in the wetlands of Friesland. He was thinking about the quiet, hollow stems of the phragmite's reed. The problem wasn't the Wisconsin winter. The problem was the Wisconsin cabin. The settlers of Sheboygan County built with what they had in abundance: timber. Their homes were monuments to the solidity of wood, 6-inch thick pine or oak logs, chinked with mud and moss. To the eye, they were fortresses, stout and impregnable. To the physics of heat, however, they were sieves. Albin Witherspoon sold lumber with the promise of strength, but he never spoke of thermal dynamics. He didn't have the language for it. A 6-inch pine log has an R value, a measure of its resistance to heat flow, of about 7.5. On a calm day, this was just enough to feel superior to a tent. But when the Arctic winds blew off the unfrozen expanse of Lake Michigan, that number became meaningless. The wind clawed away heat through a process called convection, stealing warmth from the outer surface of the logs far faster than the stove could replace it from the inside. Worse, the logs themselves were thermal bridges. The solid material of the wood acted as a direct highway for heat to escape the building. Every nail, every spike, was a tiny metal road leading warmth straight to the outdoors. The most insidious failure, however, was invisible. It was the failure to control air. The settlers' cabins were leaky, gaps in the chinking, around window frames, under doors. Each was an open wound, bleeding precious warm air out and inviting drafts of frigid air in. You could watch a candle flame flicker and dance in a supposedly sealed room, a visual testament to the constant, unseen exchange of air with the lethal cold outside. Families like the Stones and the Finches spent their winters in a state of perpetual battle. They stuffed rags into cracks. They hung heavy blankets over doorways. Their primary activity from November to March was feeding the stove. A family might burn through 10 or 12 cords of wood in a single season, a staggering amount of labor for a result that was merely survival, not comfort. The reward for all that chopping and hauling was a house where water froze in a bucket 6 feet from the fire, and where waking up to a quarter-inch of frost on the inside of the walls was simply a fact of life. This was the accepted reality. It was how things were done. It was the proven method. Sjoerd Hoogendoorn saw this reality not as an inevitability, but as a design failure. He saw his neighbors fighting the cold with brute force. More wood, thicker logs, bigger fires. They were trying to overpower the enemy. Sjoerd, the man of the marsh, knew you didn't fight the water, you worked with it, and you didn't fight the cold, you dressed for it. That spring, as soon as the ground thawed, he began his work, not on his cabin, but in the marshlands that fringed the lake. The construction of the reed wrap began in late summer and became a daily spectacle. Sjoerd used a long-handled scythe, the same kind he'd used in Friesland, to harvest thousands of common reeds or phragmites. He chose only the thickest, most mature stalks from the previous year's growth, their hollow cores fully formed and dried by the sun. He and Antje laid them out on canvas tarps to cure completely, turning them daily until they were light and brittle to the touch. The sheer volume of the material was astounding. The pile grew to the size of a small barn. Then came the bundling. Using a simple wooden jig, Sjoerd compressed handfuls of reeds into tight, uniform sheaves, which Antje then bound with lengths of hemp twine. The process was rhythmic, practiced, a muscle memory that crossed an ocean. Bundle, compress, tie. Bundle, compress, tie. For weeks, this was the sound from the Hoogendoorn plot. When they had several hundred bundles ready, the real work began. Sjoerd first nailed a grid of thin wooden battens to the outside of his pine cabin, creating a 4-inch air gap between the lumber and where the reeds would sit. This gap, he knew, was critical. It was a space of stillness. Then he began attaching the reed bundles to the battens. He started at the bottom and worked his way up, overlapping each new row over the one below it. Crucially, he laid the bundles not vertically, but on a sharp diagonal. Albin Witherspoon, watching one afternoon, couldn't contain his derision. "You've got them laid on the slant, Dutchman," he called out. "Rain's gonna get in every one of those gaps and rot that grass to mush by Christmas. You're building yourself a swamp." Sjoerd paused his work, hammer in hand. He looked at the lumber broker, his face calm. "Vertical rots," he said, his Frisian accent thick. "Water sits. Diagonal, water runs. Dries in one day." He then turned back to his work, offering no further explanation. The short, declarative statement hung in the air, a piece of knowledge so absolute it required no defense. The mockery escalated when the sheer thickness became apparent. He wasn't applying a thin layer of thatch. He was building a wall outside his wall. The final wrap was a full 36 inches thick, a massive, bristling coat that transformed the simple cabin into something alien. The windows became deep, recessed tunnels. The door looked like the entrance to a burrow. It was then that Witherspoon made his most serious objection, turning from simple mockery to a matter of public safety. He went to the small volunteer fire brigade, of which he was a founding member. "That thing is a menace," he declared at their monthly meeting. "Sjoerd Hoogendoorn has wrapped his house in kindling, one stray spark from that chimney, and it will go up so fast we'll never get a bucket of water on it. It won't just burn. It will smolder for days, a hidden fire deep in that grass, and take his family with it." The argument was persuasive because it was based on their collective experience with hay fires. The brigade voted. They delivered a formal notice to Sjoerd. His property would receive no coverage. If his grass house caught fire, they would not respond, for fear of the explosive combustion and the risk to their own men. It was a formal shunning, a community declaring his innovation not just foolish, but dangerously irresponsible. Sjoerd read the notice, folded it, and placed it on his mantelpiece. He then went outside and began mixing a thin slurry of clay and water, which he and Antje began to painstakingly apply to the outermost layer of reeds, a clay slip, to provide a final fire-resistant skin. He did not argue. He simply continued his work. To understand what Sjoerd Hoogendoorn was building, you have to stop thinking about a wall and start thinking about air. The settlers saw a 3-foot-thick layer of grass. Sjoerd saw a 36-inch layer of stillness. The secret was not the reed itself, but the immense volume of air trapped within its hollow structure and between its densely packed stems. Air, when it cannot move, is one of the most effective insulators on the planet. Let's use the language of modern building science to quantify what his old-world craft accomplished. The resistance to heat flow, or R value, of bundled Phragmites reeds is approximately R2 per inch. Sjoerd's wall was 36 inches thick. That's a staggering R value of 72 from the reed wrap alone. For comparison, Albin Witherspoon's best 6-inch pine logs offered a mere R75, but Sjoerd wasn't done. He had intentionally created a 4-inch air gap between the pine wall and the reed wrap. This unmoving, dead pocket of air added another R1 to the assembly. Finally, the pine wall itself contributed its R75. The total R value of the Hoogendoorn cabin wall was over R80. It was nearly 11 times more resistant to heat loss than any other home in the county. The genius of the system was how it defeated the 3 methods of heat transfer. Conduction, the transfer of heat through solid material, was stopped by the sheer thickness and low density of the reeds. There was simply very little solid matter for the heat to travel through. Convection, the transfer of heat through moving air, was stopped by the millions of tiny air pockets within and between the reed stems. The air was trapped, unable to circulate and carry warmth away. Finally, radiant heat transfer was slowed by the multiple layers and complex geometry of the reed surfaces. Witherspoon's criticism about rot was also born of ignorance. Sjoerd's diagonal lapping was a masterful stroke of water management. Unlike a vertical application, where water could wick down the length of the stems and become trapped, the diagonal orientation ensured that any penetrating moisture would hit the surface of the next reed below and be directed outwards. The entire 3-foot assembly was designed to breathe and shed water, drying quickly after a rain. The final clay slip wasn't just for fire resistance. It acted as a durable outer shell, protecting the reeds from the worst of the wind and weather, while still allowing water vapor to escape. Sjoerd hadn't built a tinderbox. He had built a high-performance, breathable, super-insulated wall system. He had woven a winter coat for his house, a coat made of air, held in place by grass. That winter, the lake showed its true power. It began not with a blizzard, but with a strange, deathly stillness. In mid-January, a massive high-pressure system settled over the region, pinning a layer of Arctic air to the surface. It was a classic Lake Michigan shore inversion. For 12 consecutive nights, the temperature plummeted to 24 degrees below zero. But it was the air's moisture that made it uniquely cruel. The lake, not yet frozen over, continued to exhale vast quantities of water vapor into the super-chilled air. The result was a world encased in ice. The vapor froze instantly on contact with any surface. Every tree branch, every fence wire, every rope on a flagpole grew a thick, crystalline rim of glaze ice on its windward side. The world looked beautiful, and it was lethal. Inside the standard cabins of Sheboygan County, life ground to a halt. The fires roared day and night, consuming wood at a frantic pace. At the Witherspoon house, even with 2 stoves burning, the interior walls were coated in a fine white fur of frost. Albin's wife, Sarah, had to chip ice from the inside of the kitchen window just to see outside. Their children slept in a huddled mass of blankets, their breath pluming in the bedroom air. At Jedediah Stone's farm, 2 of his best milk cows froze, standing up in his supposedly secure barn. The cold was a physical presence, an occupying force that could not be repelled. Inside the Hoogendoorn cabin, a different reality prevailed. The small wood stove murmured quietly in the corner, consuming a fraction of the wood their neighbors burned. Sjoerd would load it with a few small logs before bed, and in the morning the cabin would still be warm, the fire a bed of glowing coals ready for the day. There was no frost on the walls. There were no drafts. The air was still and calm. The deep recessed windows, far from being a strange architectural quirk, acted as passive solar collectors, their deep sills capturing any weak winter sunlight and preventing the glass from frosting over. The ultimate proof of this alternate reality sat on one of those sills. In the autumn, Antje had made several wheels of young Edam cheese. She placed one on the inner sill of the kitchen window, a space that in any other house would have been the coldest spot. Through the entire 12-day inversion, through the long, dark nights of Lent that followed, the cheese remained as she had left it. It was cool, firm, but yielding to the touch, a creamy, soft wheel of Edam. At the homes of their neighbors, cheese stored in the pantry became a yellow brick, so hard and frozen it had to be grated on a coffee mill to be eaten. Sjoerd's children, Jelle and Femke, played on the wooden floor in their stocking feet. Antje's bread dough rose beautifully in a bowl on the kitchen table. They were not surviving. They were living, peacefully and warmly, inside their cocoon of grass. The Vindication, when it came, arrived on the back of a medical emergency. On the 8th night of the inversion, Albin Witherspoon's hired man, a young fellow named Thomas, came down with a violent influenza. He was staying in the small sleeping shed behind the lumber yard, a drafty structure that offered little more than a roof. By midnight, his fever was raging, and his breathing was shallow. Witherspoon knew he needed a doctor, but the nearest one was 8 miles south, a brutal journey in the crushing cold. Bundled in every layer he owned, Witherspoon hitched his fastest horse to his sleigh and set out. The air was so cold it felt like broken glass in his lungs. The wind off the lake drove ice crystals into his exposed cheeks until they were numb and white. Halfway to his destination, he realized he couldn't feel his fingers anymore, even inside his thick woolen mittens. He was losing the fight. Ahead, a faint yellow light glowed from the deep-set window of the grass house. He hated the idea of stopping, of asking the foolish Dutchman for help. But his hands were useless, and the horse was beginning to falter, its coat white with frozen breath. Pride was a luxury the cold did not permit. He pulled the sleigh into Sjoerd's yard and stumbled to the door, rapping on the thick wood with his forearm. Sjoerd opened the door, and the first thing that struck Witherspoon was not a blast of heat, but a profound sense of calm. There was no roaring fire, no smell of scorching wood, just a gentle, enveloping warmth. "My hired man is sick," Witherspoon managed, his words slurring from the cold. "Need the doctor, my mittens. They're soaked." Sjoerd simply nodded, gestured him inside, and closed the door, shutting out the screaming wind. The silence was absolute. Witherspoon stood in the small room, stamping his feet, expecting the familiar misery of a frontier cabin, a hot spot by the stove and freezing drafts everywhere else. But there was nothing. The warmth was uniform, from the floorboards to the ceiling. It was like stepping into a different season. Antje took his frozen mittens without a word and gave him a dry pair of Sjoerd's. As Witherspoon fumbled to put them on, he began to feel a tingling in his cheeks. The numbness was receding, replaced by a painful, prickling heat as blood returned to the frozen tissue. He looked at the Hoogendoorn children, asleep in a small trundle bed, covered by a single light quilt. He saw the wheel of cheese on the windowsill, impossibly soft. He reached into his coat pocket for his pencil and small notebook, intending to write a note for the doctor. The pencil was frozen solid, The graphite shaft snapped. He held it in his palm, and as he stood there in the quiet, even warmth of the room, he felt the wood of the pencil slowly relax. The frost on its surface melted. After a minute, he could write again. That was the moment his certainty shattered. It wasn't an argument or an explanation. It was the undeniable physical proof, registered by his own frozen body. He looked at the thick, silent walls around him. He looked at Sjoerd, who was quietly adding a single, small log to the stove. Witherspoon finally spoke, his voice full of a new, grudging awe. "I don't understand," he said, gesturing at the walls. "It's just grass." Sjoerd looked up. "It is air," he corrected gently. "The grass only holds it still." Witherspoon stayed for 20 minutes, long enough for his core temperature to stabilize and his cheeks to turn a healthy pink. As he prepared to leave, he turned to Sjoerd one last time, his gaze sweeping over the peaceful, warm interior. "You didn't build a cabin, Hoogendoorn," the lumber broker said, searching for the right words. "You built a calm." The story of Albin Witherspoon's midnight visit spread almost as quickly as the news of the inversion breaking. The tale was too dramatic to ignore. The county's most prominent lumberman, a vocal critic of the grass house, seeking refuge there from the very cold his own timber-built houses could not defeat. The proof was no longer theoretical. It was a story of survival. In early March, as the thaw began, the Hoogendoorn cabin received another important visitor. Dominee Vandermeer, a Holland-American Reformed circuit preacher, made his seasonal rounds through the Wisconsin Frisian congregations. He was a man interested not only in the spiritual health of his flock, but in their physical well-being. He had heard the tales of the reed-insulated and came to see it for himself. Sjoerd, a man of faith, welcomed the Dominee warmly. He didn't boast or gloat. He simply answered the preacher's careful questions. He showed him the bundles, the diagonal lap, the 4-inch air gap. He explained in his simple Frisian Dutch the principle of still air. The Dominee, a methodical and practical man, listened intently. He took out a small leather-bound notebook and a pencil, one that was not frozen, and began to sketch. He drew the wall in cross-section. He diagrammed the 45-degree angle of the bundles. He made notes in the margins. Tie every 4 inches, 36-inch thickness, clay slip for fire. The following Sunday in a small church in Oostburg, Dominee Vandermeer delivered a sermon on the parable of the wise and foolish builders. But at the end, he spoke of practical wisdom. He told the congregation about Sjoerd Hoogendoorn, not as a strange eccentric, but as a wise man who had brought valuable knowledge from the old country. He unfolded his notes and showed them the diagram. "God gives us the materials of this new world," the preacher declared, "but he also gives us the memory of the old ways to use them wisely." That diagram, copied and passed from hand to hand, became a piece of scripture for the Frisian settlers. It was a blueprint for survival. By the time the next winter approached, 8 other families in the Dutch-speaking congregations of Sheboygan and Ozaukee counties had built their own versions of the Hoogendoorn reed wrap. The fuel savings were immediate and dramatic. Families reported cutting their wood consumption by more than half. More importantly, they reported a winter of unprecedented comfort. The era of freezing indoors was, for them, over. Sjoerd Hoogendoorn's grass-wrapped cabin stands as a testament to an intuitive understanding of building science that was decades ahead of its time. What he did with reeds, twine, and clay anticipated the core principles behind some of the most advanced modern construction techniques. The concept of separating the structural wall from a thick outer layer of insulation is the very definition of a high-performance building envelope today. Modern builders use materials like rock wool, cellulose, or foam board instead of phragmites, but the principle of the outsolation sleeve is identical. By wrapping the exterior, they eliminate thermal bridging through the wood studs, creating a continuous, unbroken blanket of insulation. Sjoerd's 3-foot-thick wall, with its astonishing R80 value, surpasses the energy codes of even the most stringent modern standards. His creation was, in effect, a primitive form of a structural insulated panel, or SIP, combining structure and insulation into a single, cohesive system. His 4-inch air gap is now understood as a vital component for moisture management and thermal performance, a feature designed into modern rain-screen wall assemblies. This Frisian reed bundler, with no formal training in physics or engineering, had built one of the first truly super-insulated homes in North America. The final reflective truth of Sjoerd Hoogendoorn's innovation is found in its relationship with the landscape. His neighbors saw the brutal Wisconsin winter and the vast, menacing lake as an enemy to be walled out. They built fortresses of solid timber, engaging in a costly, losing battle against the cold. Their approach was one of confrontation. Sjoerd saw the same landscape and found a solution within it. He looked at the useless, overgrown marsh grass that choked the shoreline, a plant others ignored or cursed, and recognized it as the perfect tool for survival. He understood that the very thing that defined the edge of the lake could be woven into a shelter against the lake's fury. He didn't insulate his cabin against the lake. He wove the lake's grass into a coat the cabin could wear. His solution was one of harmony, not of conflict. It was a quiet lesson, written in reeds and twine, that the answers to our greatest challenges are often not in fighting the world around us, but in understanding it deeply enough to wear it as our own. Thank you for joining us for this story of frontier ingenuity. If you found this exploration of historical building science as fascinating as we did, please hit the like button and subscribe for more content. We believe the past holds countless lessons for the future. Let us know in the comments what you think was the most ingenious part of Sjoerd's design: the thickness, the air gap, or the diagonal lap. We look forward to reading your thoughts. Disclaimer: this video presents a historically inspired reconstruction for educational and storytelling purposes. The characters, names, and specific events depicted are fictional, but the techniques and scientific principles are based on real historical practices. The application of any building technique today should be done in accordance with modern building codes, safety guidelines, and professional consultation. This content does not constitute professional, technical, or legal advice.